You are listening to Dissecting Worlds, the Geek Syndicate podcast on the social sciences and science fiction, fantasy and horror. What do they know of geekery, if only geekery know? And now, over to your hosts.
Hello, you're listening to Dissecting Worlds, and another break in our series on legendary creators. Although I don't know, we might be speaking to a legendary creator today.
In advance,
now I've blown the skirts. We are joined by James Desborough, who, amongst other products, writes role-playing games and has recently written a role-playing game set in the universe of, and this is where I hope I get the creator's name correct, John Norman's Gore, a series of sword and planet books that have a certain reputation that may or may not be deserved, but when you look at the background, would seem to make a suitable background for a role-playing game. So, without further ado, before we get into Gore and the RPG, do you want to tell people a little bit about your stuff, James?
I can do. I'm primarily a role-playing game creator. I've been doing that for about 20 years. Used to do it part-time. After the dot-com crash in the early 2000s, I started doing it full-time. So I've been doing that for about 15 years now. Scary looking back at it. So yeah, I've done all kinds of stuff really. I've worked for Wizards of the Coast. I've worked for Steve Jackson Games. I've worked for Nightfall Games, Cubicle 7, all sorts of people. But I'm primarily focused on publishing for myself now. I have something of a reputation for dealing with controversial topics and issues, which I guess Gore falls into quite nicely and squarely. I guess the stuff people might know me best for is probably bits and pieces of D&D work. Things like I did some work on Eberron, the sort of massive multiplayer online computer game tie-in. For that, myself and my co-creator, Steve Mortimer, wrote the Munchkin's Guide to Power Gaming that kicked off the whole Munchkin franchise, and work I've done on SLA Industries and stuff for Call of Cthulhu and, all that kinds of stuff. And I also write a bit, trying to do more of that, writing more fiction. I've got a full-length novel called Old Fat Punks and a collection of short stories called Pulp Nova. And I just finished crowdfunding a non-fiction book, which is a kind of social history of the whole Gamergate thing. So, keeping the controversial topics thing alive.
Right. Okay. So we might come on to that a bit later on, maybe. So, Gore. Do you want to go into Gore first, or do you want to? Shall we start off with why Gore? Why a Gore role-playing game? Shall we start there and then get into Gore itself?
Start wherever you like.
All right. So let's. Yeah. Why a Gore role-playing game?
Sorry, I was going to say let's do a quick why Gore and why is Gore different for people that haven't heard of it. I think that's probably a good introduction.
Well, like you described, it's kind of a sword and planet thing. And there's kind of an obsession with a lot of game designers for the pulps. Norman's work isn't exactly pulp. It's too late. He started writing in the 60s, but it's very much informed by the pulps. I kind of describe it as Barsoom meets Velikovsky, because there's a lot of kind of ancient alien sort of stuff going on in the background. And then what's given it its reputation, and part of what makes it so interesting for me are its controversial elements, which are kind of the male-dominated society and some sort of bondage and domination themed sort of themes going on in the writing. So yeah, I'm attracted to controversial topics and for some time now I've been interested in. I mean, in games, people take violence for granted, just kind of running around chopping orcs' heads off or whatever. That's all a jolly good fun time, and nobody bats an eyelid, and quite right, they shouldn't. But people there's a double standard when it comes to sexual elements, and lots of people don't necessarily want to think about the implications of the fantasy societies in which their games take place. And for all Norman gets criticised for the quality of his writing and whatever else, his world building is very good. And I think that's one of the most essential elements in any role-playing game is the world needs to be interesting. There needs to be space for your characters to move and do stuff. You need to understand the world that you're in, and that's one of the major things that makes a good game, because when you're writing a game, you're not telling a story. You're creating an environment in which other people can make their stories. So when you're transitioning something from fiction to game, if it has a really well thought out and consistent and in many ways believable world setting, that makes all of that work. So so it's something different. It plays to the pulp elements that a lot of people are interested in. I'm interested in as well. It's got that high adventure element, which is familiar to everybody, but then it's got these other elements, these social and sexual elements that have always interested me as a designer, as a writer, as a kind of historian of fiction and science fiction and so on. So that's why. I mean, it's been kicked around for a very long time for it to be a game. There was an abortive attempt to do a D20 system version of it a while back that seemed to fall through. And it meets a lot of kickback and so on from people, particularly lately as the kind of political social environment has changed around fiction and creativity. But that just drove me to do it all the more. So
right. Because when we started talking about this on Twitter, and some other people were pitching it. I mean, I'll be honest with you. First of all, total cards on the table. My sexual tastes, such as I have any, are very, very vanilla. So, almost perversely vanilla. So, but that's me. So, there's certain things that don't really float my boat there. My memories of gore is either it being mentioned in outrage tones of what now would be called social justice warrior, but outrage of I always like the phrase more sort of Bernard Wright on indignation, or somebody who maybe didn't take too many showers, sort of slavering at the lips when it came up in conversation, which was equally if not more so uncomfortable. so those are the two kind of associations it has in my mind. Now,
sorry, can I just to add to that? I used to run a university. I involved in running a science fiction library, science fiction and fantasy library. And when I started there as a society member and a volunteer librarian, we were pointed at the gore shelves, or one of the shelves that were pointed out to us as, watch the people that come and borrow those. Now, I never really came across any outrage about them. I came across a lot of snobbery about them. And I, as regular listeners to the show will know, I have my whole issues about the fantasy genre, full stop, that I've struggled to get past in the last few years and actually read some fantasy novels. So having this pointed out as like the fantasy, but with like fantasy for perverts, was like just not something that I was interested in. And I appreciate that may be unfair, or it may be totally fair, but genuinely that was it. It was genuinely regarded as slightly higher than L. Ron Hubbard.
Well, yeah.
So, there was that going for it, I guess. And being a science fiction nerd, I have read L. Ron Hubbard, but not gore.
Yeah. I have a slight weakness for the Mission Earth decology. I don't know, there's just something about that tickles my fancy, I think.
I've read it all. I'm perversely proud of having got through it.
I like trash fiction. I like B movies. I like straight to video stuff. You know, so
yeah, I have a soft spot for that as well. As I said, my tastes run more to science fiction and fantasy, but yes, I do like B movie trash.
And I think John Norman's quite an interesting guy in and of himself, isn't it? Because he's, if I'm right, is he a doctor of philosophy?
Yeah, John Norman's his pen name. I think it's John Lang. I'm not sure how you pronounce it, Lang or Lange, something like that. And he is a professor of philosophy. So
he's also he also wrote a sex manual, basically.
Yeah,
called Imaginative Sex.
Imaginative Sex, which is along the same sort of themes. He's written a few other books with similar kind of underlying themes to his work. So there's definitely a thing that he does. He has his obsessions that come out in his work. So
yeah. But what I have heard talked about imaginative sex, and I don't know how this does or doesn't feed into the contents of the Gore books, and we can go there, is that because I think we're pussy. I don't know. I'm not sure. We may be pussyfooting around things a bit, but basically, correct me if I'm wrong, Jim. In this universe, on this planet, it's a male-dominated society. There is slavery. There are female slaves. There is I don't know if it goes as far as being a sort of sado-dom thing, or whether it's inverted commas just bondage element to the relations on that planet between the sexes. Is that a fair summary?
Okay. Let me see. Like you say, pussyfooting. Okay, I won't pussyfoot around. Okay. It is a male-dominated society. Absolutely. There is slavery, but it's of both genders. What occurs in the books tends to focus around female slavery and male dominance, though there are bits that go the other way here and there. But in the description of the world, there's way more male slaves than female slaves. They're just off camera. So you've got fighting slaves, working slaves in the mines and so on. But obviously it's far more interesting and titillating for the reader to hear about half-naked slave girls than it is about, men working and dying in mines. And part of the underlying premise of the world is that, at least so far as Gore is concerned, that male dominance and female submission is the natural and proper order of the world. This is the part that I think tends to ruffle people's feathers more than necessarily the sex and the BDSM aspect. Because, by the standards of today's writing, what's in the books is pretty tame. It's suggestive. It goes further than Conan. There's no question about what the hero is doing with the girl that he rescues or whatever. You know what's going on, but it's not in
50 Shades of Grey.
Yeah, it's not in 50 Shades kind of dripping detail or purple prose or whatever. It doesn't go that far. But I think what upsets people is the implication, which to me is a little weird because, if you look at some of the other kind of social science fiction, which I would kind of drop Gore into. You look at the societies in Dune, or, you look at the things that we accept in other fictional worlds, like the existence of magic or whatever. Those underlying presuppositions about the fantasy world that are set up that guide and shape the whole description of the world. And in this one, there is this particular idea which shapes the whole dynamic of the world, but people become offended by it as though it's meant to be real or whatever. I don't know to what extent Norman believes in this philosophy. One of the criticisms he gets is he spends a lot of time lecturing in the books, which is kind of true, but he is a professor, so I think a certain amount of lecturing is to be expected. But for most people who read this, I think it's purely fantasy. There are people who take it into real life, who live out their fantasy, just like some people call themselves Jedis and do lightsaber classes or whatever. I see it on the same level as that. It doesn't bother me. Whatever floats your boat is fine. And you say you're vanilla, right?
Oh,
I'm not. I am kinky, so I get that that side of it does something for me, but it doesn't mean that I think this is how the world should be or whatever else. And there is a huge online community, many, even most of which are women who are into this, just as you look at people who bought 50 Shades or whatever.
Mhm.
You know, I think it's important to draw that parallel and to note that for a lot of people, this is a fantasy in more senses than one. You know, it's not just a science fantasy book. It's, you know, it taps into their kinky desires, and that's what's kept the series going and kept it popular, I think, is that mix of the two elements. You know, a safe fantasy world in which you can play out these things that interest you.
And it's a USP, isn't it? As a product. That's
as base commerce, is that what you're saying?
No, but I mean, but that's what gets you X amount of published books. I mean, how many published versions? Are there 20 volumes published?
34 published volumes.
Yeah, so
he had a bit of a break because at the height of the previous kind of PC panic in the 90s, he couldn't get published anymore. And that was kind of just prior to internet publishing really, really taking off. So there's there's a period of years in which he couldn't get published. But during that period, that's when the kind of whole online Korean community came up, you know, with people playing it out, role-playing it, freeform in chat rooms and on Second Life.
I seem to think there was a Channel 4 documentary that touched on it. I suspect it wasn't massively sympathetic being on Channel 4, but I'm sure there was something.
There were a couple of scandals involving Korean lifestyle people, with a woman being held against her will and so on.
Maybe that's what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, I think there was a report or a documentary about that. There's been a couple of instances of that, but I think you can find that kind of creepy weirdness going on in any fandom if you go digging hard enough. I don't think it reflects on the broader community.
I guess like most fandoms, you don't hit the news for just going about your business, do you?
Well, no, I mean, bad example maybe, but look at furries, you know. That's not my bag, in the same way that I can understand that gore and BDSM whatever may not be other people's bag, but you know, they're not hurting anybody. And yet they keep making the news and they keep showing up on, you know, crime dramas or whatever, because it tickles people's fancy and makes them, you know, titter and laugh to see the weirdo in the costume being dissected on the NCIS slab or whatever, you know, and that's when you hear about them. Yeah.
It's like any detective show that goes beyond 4 seasons has to have a compulsory Wiccan episode.
Yeah, exactly.
You know,
or actually just a D&D player episode. In fairness, they've become a bit of a trope in their own rights, and that's just like throwing dice at each other around a table. It's hardly threatening the tenor of society.
Yeah. I miss being Dangerous Satanists. It sold a lot of books.
Hey, it got me on the front of the local newspaper.
Yeah?
When I was 15, yeah. Devil game denied. Yeah.
I always find it weird that people were upset about things like Dungeons and Dragons when games like Over the Edge existed.
Yeah, it's a bit odd.
But that was a bit later, wasn't it? And you know, that involved more reading and not cliches. So, yeah, I hadn't come across like the Second Life stuff. I was kind of aware of it. I had come across ages ago where I had a job that was not my current employer, but several employers down the line, where basically we were given a job that the main internal users of our services didn't want to use us. So we were basically being paid to sit there looking at the internet all day. And some Fred ended up taking me to like an old bulletin board or a very old creaky website that was how you should live your Gorian lifestyle, what arrangements you should have, and then like a little sort of caveat paragraph about safe words somewhere tucked away. It was just like, obviously I got off it pretty quickly once I started joining the dots because I was in work. But it was, so I was aware that there were people who kind of, if you like, LARP it, or even, you know, when they get home and they shut the door, that's how they live their life. Which
yeah.
I think like any what's the best way of putting this? Any gender power relationships, providing a consensual, because some people may have issues with the way certain monotheistic religions, in some cases, run those kind of things. But if it's consensual, who are you to say, kind of thing?
Yeah, that's kind of where I'm at with it. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's the difficulty becomes, I think, from outsiders, like, well, how do you know it's consensual? How do you know it's his or her choice in whatever the context is? And, until we develop mind melding, it's going to be a bit difficult to get to the bottom of.
Yeah.
So when you took the challenge, because we've mentioned 30 odd books there, how as a project do you go about distilling that into a role-playing game, B, boiling that down into a legible form in a role-playing game for somebody who might not be familiar with the whole body of material, and thirdly, keep that USP in it at the right level.
Yeah, that was incredidly challenging. I mean, there's a huge body of work. There's the sensitivity of the subject. I've had my skirmishes with the social justice-y type people before, so I knew they'd be watching what I was doing. I was also dealing with a rather rabid and fanatical fan base, which I've had to do before and hasn't been a lot of fun in previous instances, especially when there's been a gap, like in Norman's work, because, while he wasn't writing, people were kind of making it their own thing and coming up with their own ideas, and then they become very protective and possessive of what they've made up. So there was I mean, that's like Star Trek fandom, isn't it? In the gap between original series and TNG, there was a lot of fan work that went there that suddenly had the heart torn out of it. Yeah. It was incredibly challenging. I mean, the way I went about it was I'd been ruminating on the idea for quite a few years, and then finally managed to find the right contact information to get hold of the people I needed to get hold of about licensing. Mm-hmm. So I'd already been thinking about it for a while on how to approach it. Once I got the go ahead, I started by going back to the books and I reread every single one. That was challenging in and of itself because there's been revisions to some of the books. In some territories, certain parts of the books have been censored, like the German versions of the Korean books are even thinner and even tamer than they are elsewhere. There's contradictions in what's written in some of the books. So even if you're going back to canon and you're trying to faithfully reproduce the canonical material, you're still facing a whole bunch of challenges. But that's where I started.
I mean, how consistent is it as a world from the canon, or how much of it are you trying to stitch bits together and saying we won't use that bit or we'll use that bit?
It's pretty consistent. One of the things I would definitely praise Norman for, over and above all his critics, is that I think his world building is pretty much spot on. Once he's in his stride, after about, I don't know, I guess the 6th or 7th book, you stop getting so many contradictions and issues, and some of that you can write off to saying, well, the world is a changing and dynamic place, so certain things are different. I mean, early on in his books, part of the thing is it's divided up into city states, and early in the books, people didn't really travel between the cities, and strangers were automatically considered to be enemies. But later in the books, I mean, it's basically a travelogue, a lot of it, from his viewpoint character, Tal Cabot, moving from place to place to place. And that kind of falls away and it becomes much more cosmopolitan. So that's kind of one of the big contradictions in the books. But you can say that that's down to things changing in the world. So that's one way of handling it. But I mean, right from the start, my plan was to divide it into 2 books, partly because I figured there were a lot of Gore fans who wouldn't want the role-playing game. And partly because there was just so much material. So I split it into an encyclopedia of the world and then the role-playing books separate. So if you want to play the RPG, you really need both books, because the RPG book gives you a kind of overview of the world and tells you what you can do as an adventurer or whatever within it. But then the encyclopedia goes into more detail. But that's also useful for people who are just into the books and want it as a reading companion to the books, or want to use it for their fan fiction, or in building their chat rooms or their virtual reality worlds or whatever. So I was always very conscious of that, and that was really the main way I went about dealing with the sheer volume of material, was by splitting it into those two different volumes. And that took care of most of the problem, I think.
So I guess the follow-up question then becomes, so from a role-playing game, if you're new to role-playing, what's your archetypal adventure?
I've tried to kind of sketch out as many different kind of options as possible in the game, rather than saying that there's one singular way to do it.
Oh yeah, sure.
So I devote part of one chapter to saying, okay, these are all the ways I can think of that you could make a game work. So it's like, maybe you could be the entourage of a merchant who's going from city to city buying and selling stuff, and your guards that work for him, and maybe he hires you out for mercenary work on the side, or you get caught up in machinations and politics or whatever. But the underlying theme of the books as a whole is this war between these two alien powers that are kind of in the background. The Kehaar, who are like this very warlike and very genuinely alien species that's come to our solar system from outside, and this other alien species called the Priest Kings, who are kind of like the protectors of our solar system, particularly protectors of Gore. They manipulate it and keep it at a fairly primitive level and so on, and they like godlike technology in a lot of ways. And that's what's going on in the background, and both of these alien powers operate through people, so there's a lot of espionage and machinations and plots and secret missions and stuff going on. So by default, my assumption, and in the adventure sort of chain that I'm creating in support of the books, my assumption is that your characters are wittingly or unwittingly agents of one of these alien powers and working towards their ends. So that provides an excuse to kind of order people around or get them caught up in more bizarre adventures. But the real thrust of it, despite it being a fantasy world, is really these kind of political machinations, assassinations, banditry, weird stuff going on in the background, the plots and schemes between cities and powers. That's where the main thrust of it is.
So your big kind of conflict is manifesting through city-state conflicts and politicians and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Proxy wars.
Yeah.
That sort of thing.
Okay, cool. Makes sense.
You mentioned like splitting it out into the encyclopedia and now into the role-playing game. Now, is the encyclopedia totally system neutral? It's literally just a pure encyclopedia. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that was the other reason for doing it. A lot of gamers prefer to kit bash and create their own, their own versions. So if you get the encyclopedia and your own favourite system, you should be able to bash something together. I think someone's already reported back to me they're doing a Savage Worlds version. Someone else was talking about using 13th Age to do something with it. So yeah, the encyclopedia is system neutral. You can use that as a resource for anything that you wanted to do.
So how does that work rights-wise? Because presumably you've got the rights to write a role-playing game for it, but if somebody goes and kit bashes it for something that's open system, presumably you could jump all over their pointed little head if they publish it?
Yeah, they couldn't publish it. They
Legally,
would have
I mean.
rights. Yeah, that would be down to Norman's agent to deal with them if they did that. But I don't think they care so long as fans do it.
I think if it's not for profit, it's a different thing, isn't it?
You got a big fan fiction scene as well. So
Norman's a bit gun shy on that. There were some attempts to try and quash some of the online stuff a while back, kind of half-hearted. because people have done some things and profited off his material when they shouldn't have been able to. I'm not sure how much detail I can go into, but his ideas have been used without permission, have earned people money of which he's not seen a penny, and there's been many projects that haven't been done to a state that he was happy with, or that he felt was true to the source material. I mean, like the 2 films that were done of Gore are just awful.
Oh God, I've seen one of them. One of them. I think I saw the second, and it's risible, and it doesn't even have the USP in it.
Yeah. Well, there's some women with big hair and boobs in it. That's about as far as it goes.
It's the 80s. It's the 80s. That was every film. It was just, and so part of my question earlier on was, how do you mechanically fold in the sexual politics of Gore into the role-playing game?
I forgot to answer that, didn't I? But I do tend to waffle on, so feel free to cut me off if I go on too long.
We have been known to waffle a little bit ourselves, so you're in good company there.
Okay, so like I was saying, it's a bit difficult to balance the demands of the world and yet have an idea, knowing that people are going to criticize you and be watching everything you do. I try to not self-censor. I try to brush that off, but I have had a lot of problems professionally and so on with people coming after me because I do controversial work. So I've tried to keep it kind of optional in the book because you don't necessarily know what people are going to want to do with it. Maybe they want to play an heroic liberation of the women of Gore or something. That's...
I'm going to say the role-playing contrarian in me instantly went, can I play a female character?
Yes, you can.
It's just like, that's just the contrarian in me. And he goes, that, and is that going to be, would that be fun?
There are actually plenty of strong female characters in the Gorean series. People don't seem to appreciate or understand that. Of course, most of them get their comeuppance and end up in chains at the end, but for a while, they're quite powerful and interesting. There's Talina, who's kind of like the princess of Ar, who ends up betraying and messing up the entire city. There's a leader of the Panther Girls, who are like these rebel ex-slaves and free women who wander in the forest to the north, and she's said to be completely untamable and all the rest of it. There's female leaders of bandits. A lot of the espionage agents and things are very effective, and they're women. So there's a lot of that going on. But going back to the system stuff, I did a kind of callback to something controversial from the really early editions of D&D, where it was suggested that maybe women and men should have different statistics. So given the nature of the world, it seemed to make sense to do that. So I've provided an optional set of rules where men and women's statistic range differs. So men are inherently stronger than women on average, at least anyway. So, so they've got certain advantages that way, and women have certain advantages the other. The other thing with the Gorean world is that it's not something you can necessarily quantify in statistics, but women have a tremendous amount of social advantages in the world. If you're a woman and you're not a slave, you have this kind of inherent level of respect. People are supposed to look after you. There's all kinds of rules about how you're supposed to be treated and so on, provided you stick with the rules of the society. So women have a lot more freedom in a lot of ways, so long as they're not slaves within this world. But
this is presumably gilded cage stuff, I presume.
Yeah, to an extent, but a lot of it's drawn from history as well. I mean, Norman's heavily into his classics, his kind of Greek and Roman stuff, and there's a lot of influence from that onto the slave culture and so on. And women are running their households and handling the money, and a lot of them are business owners and so on. So there's that whole aspect as well. So, I mean, you have to be cognizant of the world and how it works if you want to play a woman within the game, but it's perfectly possible, and works well, and the characters can be very powerful in their own way. Even slave girls can be. They've got their ways and means of getting things done.
So in terms of, I'm just trying to think of you went to a historical analogy there. So it'd be the same question, say, if I wanted to play a woman in a Roman game, you've got a lot of very strong restrictions on what you can do in Roman times as a woman. Yeah,
or even a Victorian game.
Well, having just finished a book about late 18th, 19th century woman, the social restrictions she operated under was actually horrific by modern standards.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a bugbear of mine, some of these historical games that just kind of wash over or ignore or whitewash the difficulties that, say, people of colour or women had in those societies. I mean, if you want to play the exception to the rule, fine, but for me, part of the appeal of playing in historical periods or other cultures is experiencing those.
Now, I quite like this section in the new edition of Call of Cthulhu, which talks about that right in the face. It's a game set in the 20s in the States, right?
Yeah.
So if you're playing a person of colour, you're playing a woman, you're going to have these problems. And it basically says, as a GM, ask your players, if they want to play it realistically, play it realistically. If they don't. If you want to say you're in a slightly fantasy parallel world, where you can play a female black librarian who can go into Alabama with a shotgun and shoot some guy, and that's fine.
Yeah.
That's fine, because your players should be having fun. But don't pretend that's historically accurate, but be aware that you're doing it inaccurately, and that's fun, and that's fine.
Yeah, that's the final arbiter for me, is what's fun for your players. For me, as a player, part of the fun of a game is experiencing other cultures and situations, and whether it's racism in Southern America in the 1920s, or whether it's facing down a wizard in a tower to steal an orb, I want to experience that.
And there's definitely
I was going to say, and there's probably also part of the conversation at the table is how you play it, because people might say, well, we want to play it realistically, but there might be certain words which triggers to them. For instance, that you would include if you were going to do it method actors. But if you're not, you'd allude to it. Like you might, if you had younger players at the table, tone down the graphic descriptions of violence or whatever. It's just finding the tone that your players are happy with. I mean, talking about playing games with restrictions, I'm running play by email Pendragon at the moment, which is going quite well, I think. But one of the interesting things in that is when I was toasting this around, one guy came up and said, "Do I have to play a knight?" It's kind of like, well, it's King Arthur Pendragon. The whole point is to play knights. That might not be your bag, and that's fine. But I'm not gonna kind of sell you on it. You're playing knights. You're going to form a gilded age. You will die. Your sons will take over. It will all fall to shit. That's the point.
Yeah.
So if you want to play a bard or a cleric or something, there's lots of other games out there, and I think that would be part of the same conversation, presumably, if you were taking your product off the shelf and talking to people at your gaming club or online or whatever it would be. This is set in Gore. This is part of the world. I, as the GM, am comfortable to this extent with this part of the world. That will be part of the experience at the table. If you're happy with that, or that's something that floats your boat, great. If you're not, then and also as part of that, you would probably have a conversation at what point you drew the veil. At what point you faded to black would be part of the conversation as well. And that's because role playing is such a consensual activity. I think and there's always going to be a few missteps and a little bit of give and take, but that's got to be a conversation at the start, because otherwise you're on a high dig to drama.
Yeah, I mean, when you're working with your normal kind of regular gaming group, you all kind of usually already know each other's limits and so on, and so that works fine. Problems I've run into, and not just running demos of Gore or whatever, is convention games. If I put up a sign-up sheet and I say adult content or horrific content or whatever, or if I put up an adventure called Temple of the Spider Queen or whatever, and then someone comes at my table and says, "Oh, well, I can't handle this. I don't like spiders." That's.
Can I leave my 12-year-old here?
That's not the time to be raising those issues. It's on the sign-up sheet, or we've talked about it beforehand. Don't interrupt in the middle of a game and tell me you can't handle something as it was advertised. There seems to be an increasing culture of one player who feels slightly uncomfortable, feels that it's perfectly within their bounds to disrupt and screw up the game for the other 6 or however many other people are at the table. I can't abide that. There's this thing called X cards, which is kind of meant to be a kind of enforced, fade to black on everyone else. But when it comes to convention games, if the sign-up sheet says adult content, I think people should keep in mind the fun of everyone else around the table and just kind of suck it up. But yeah, with your own group, you kind of know where each other stand, hopefully. So it doesn't come up.
I find convention. I'll be honest. I've run a couple of convention games recently, and they've gone pretty well. One went so well that I rolled it out for another convention. But those were very much relatively light-hearted, if pretty violent, sort of men on a mission stuff.
Yeah.
Contemporary or recent historical, and I kind of went for that deliberately because I thought that kind of irons out those issues. And yes, I did have female pre-gens in the 1920s, and I did have a person of colour, but I also kind of had it set up so they were in niches where that would work. But I think it's almost, I'm not sure whether adult content, just from my point of view, if I signed up for a game, what my idea of adult content might be different to yours, might be different to Matt's, might be different to Tracy down the road, or somebody else. And I think it's, you probably don't want to go to like a BBFC review of a game that gives away all the twists and turns, don't you? But it's always how you get that description across. And it could be hard because I advertised one game as 1970s Doctor Who unit, and it was like, I've never watched an episode of Doctor Who, and it's like, well, it's not important because the Doctor's not there. But it was also like, well, if you're not comfortable with it, again, I'm not going to beg you.
Yeah,
that's fine.
Yeah,
because there's no point you turning up to something where you're halfway minded that you won't have fun.
Yeah, what you were saying about the kind of ratings thing. I mean, yeah, you've got to balance between warning people of what's going to be in the game and spoilers. Yeah, some people seem to want these kind of lists of trigger warnings or whatever of every single thing that might possibly be objectionable to anyone in your game. And if you do that, you give away the entire plot to one extent or another. Yeah. So,
and I suppose words have a different context in their setting. So, for example, if you had a game that featured a racial epithet, but say that was said by the big bad and was like, the kind of and he beats his wife as well moment, was an incentive to your players then, machine gunning down his minions and blowing up his volcano. That may well have a slightly different weight to if you're actually having to cooperate with this Louisiana sheriff to bring down the Cthulhu cultists.
Yeah, and he turns out to be a bit
and racist. His language, and he's a Louisiana sheriff. If he's not in the clan, he's good drinking buddies with him, and his language is going to be upsetting to me. But that's totally different.
That semantic issue is one I ran into with Gore. Norman uses the word rape, but he uses it closer to its kind of older meanings of forceful but not necessarily non-consensual. But people very strongly react to the use of that word. So that's presented some issues.
Yeah, and you could see why, and I can see why, and I can see why, because of the issues around sexual violence that we still have in societies today, that would be an issue for people. And it's almost like how far do you go down the line of kind of giving clarification to these terms? Because when you're to give another context, one of my gaming environments at the moment is a little micro pub around the corner. Mm-hmm. They very kindly make 2 tables available to us. This used to be a bookshop, so it's a small pub. Yeah. Now, I've been a little sensitive where we're playing our Irish-American gangsters in the gangbusters, and people are talking about going down the road to bomb the local synagogue. Yeah. Not because of anything, but because that's where the Jewish gangsters will all be on a convenient Saturday, whether it's like somebody's bar mitzvah, and we want to get them all in the same place. Yeah. So you can't really have a sign up saying, "Don't worry, it's all just let's pretend." So context is all matter. You're surprisingly quiet.
I'm actually finding it quite interesting, actually. Interestingly, from talking about convention games and kind of context being important, one of my role-playing horror stories from a convention game was a Call of Cthulhu game many years ago, which was set in immediately post-Civil War, Mississippi. It was set in a riverboat, which is quite a cool setting for a Call of Cthulhu game, I think. And it was supposed to be voodoo inflected and all this kind of stuff. But obviously, it's set in like 1870 on a Mississippi riverboat. Obviously, everybody in that world is staggeringly racist. And then the character that I got was a Southern revivalist Baptist preacher Confederate veteran. Who pretty much had on his character sheet, "You are terrifyingly racist, even by the standards of the period." And it's like, okay, fine. I don't know any of these people around the table. This is a convention game. They've never met me. I don't know them. And the plot is voodoo inflected. So, except as you might expect, being a game set in the 90s, being a game run in the 90s, obviously the voodoo characters are actually the good guys. They're the people you go to for help, right? Yeah. And to help with the kind of river cultist inbred yokel type characters, which again so far so good. 2 problems with this. 1, I've got a staggeringly racist character. I'm pretty much unlikely to listen to the voodoo priestess in the basement, which is giving me good information. Secondly, one of the players was black. And it's one of the most uncomfortable gaming experiences of my life. And it's like, and I still kind of think, like, is the mistake in the characters or the setting, or because
that's a really interesting story to me, because I've had similar experiences, but it's been the other black player that's been absolutely fine and cool with it all, and it has been the
I'm sure he may well have been, but of course I didn't know him.
Yeah, but it's been the kind of Rick Mail and the Young Ones type other white middle class players who've been the ones that have been freaked out and shocked.
I am a freaked out white middle class player. I don't know what you're saying. But yeah, it's a weird thing, because obviously from a gaming experience point of view, I actually think that's probably fine, right? And I did try and roll with it. I did end up pointing a gun at the rest of the party, and they had to kill me. Yeah. As a way of solving the situation, which I think from a role-playing perspective is fair enough. God knows what they thought of me. I could have come across as like the obstructionist, that obstructionist guy, who just doesn't want to get with the program or what, I don't know. Because you get those guys in convention games as well.
I think from the discomfort, that sounds like a really interesting game setup to me.
I think it's an interesting game setup, and it's the kind of thing, I'd love to play that again. I'd love to, and it's a good setting, and that era is quite an interesting setting. That kind of early West, Old West setting. Yeah. It's something I quite like.
I'm sure everyone knew it was the character, and
I'm retrospectively, but at the time when you're young, you don't know these people. You're like, oh my god.
Yeah.
What are you asking me to do? And and in fairness, like I said, I did end up like pulling a gun on like the rest of the party and saying, we're not listening to this, black nonsense.
to bring
sorry
it back to Gore,
to the other player, and I think maybe Gore potentially would have that as a convention setting. So I don't know
to bring it back. There's a difference between the situation with Gore and the situation you're describing. I mean, in that world in which you're playing, even if your character is horrendously racist, there is no suggestion in the rules or whatever that anyone is genuinely racially inferior or anything. Whereas in Gore, it is an underlying principle of the world, whether you choose to indulge it with game statistics or not, that there are certain things that are inherently true about masculinity. There are certain things that are inherently natural and true about femininity. Women are mostly naturally submissive. Men are mostly naturally dominant. And these are baked into the world if you choose to the same extent that orcs have +2 strength and are naturally evil in D&D or whatever. It's a fundamental. Whereas what you're describing is attitudes and interpretations that have zero actual bearing on characters' capabilities or whatever in the game world. So it's a bit different.
Oh sure, but I can imagine.
And am I right in thinking that Gorians are actually transplanted Earth humans, or are they parallel evolution? So that makes it more controversial if they are transplanted Earth humans.
Yeah, I mean, if I can go into that for just a little bit. There are various cultures that have been kind of plucked off Earth and brought to this other world. These aliens, the Priest Kings, almost run it like a wildlife preserve or a zoo. So from their point of view, they're kind of keeping humans in their natural state in a way. And there's this suggestion that the way in which Goreans live is more natural and fulfilling, even though it's violent, even though most of their technology is more primitive and so on. The world is clean. There isn't this massive amount of industry or whatever. Their science is more advanced in some areas, but they still fight wars with swords and crossbows and whatever. Whereas Earth society is presented as being kind of repressed and unnatural and twisted, and that people aren't happy because they're not living out the way humans are supposed to live naturally, or whatever.
How far off Conan's anti-civilization theme are we with this then?
It's more.
I think they have civilization.
Yeah, it's a different civilization.
But those themes come up.
Yeah,
those themes come up a lot. Because I think I've seen an article. I don't know if it was The Economist or something, but it was something I followed that came up and was saying one of the reasons we're unhappy in Western civilization is because our actual work is so cerebral and so sedentary. And are there ways we can hire work? We can sort of wire in more physical activity into our work, which will release the endorphins that our ancestors got doing heavy manual labour.
Yeah, in a way, I think.
So, in the idea that was a more natural state of being.
Yeah, I think if you look at Conan is anti-civilization, as you say, in a way. That's an underlying theme of Conan. That's a way to be free. In Gore, you're more looking at there's a different way of setting up civilization in Gore that is supposed to be more fulfilling. And then you can draw a line from that, I think, to the current fetish for post-apocalyptic fiction, where we kind of tear down the world that we have, and lots of people genuinely fantasize about zombie apocalypse or the end of the world or whatever, and in a way they see that as liberating and a kind of return to the natural, I suppose.
Oh, I think that's totally true, and that cuts straight across the kind of social political spectrum as well. The post-apocalyptic thing.
I mean, the American post-apocalyptic theme tends to be more back to kind of bootstraps, cowboy mentality sort of thing, whereas British post-apocalyptic fiction is more kind of cozy apocalypse, back to the land sort of thing. So, but those themes, I mean, you can draw those all the way. You can draw a chain between all these different interpretations of that same sort of theme. There does seem to be this dissatisfaction, weirdly, with all the wonders of civilization that we have, and and a yearning for other things that would actually be much worse in a lot of ways.
But it's the old saying, isn't it, where people sort of always picture themselves in the zombie apocalypse, the ghost on top of a car with a chainsaw and a shotgun, whereas actually what you are is one of the zombies.
Yeah.
Like,
it's a kind of fictional version of that Steinbeck quote. That socialism never took off in America because Americans don't see themselves as oppressed. They see themselves as temporarily embarrassed millionaires. It's everyone thinks they're a ninja. It's just temporarily embarrassed ninjas.
Yeah, definitely. Come to day, I do this and it would be fine. And if only I could be away from this. And it's escapism, isn't it? I mean, gore's a very specific flavour of escapism, but I don't think there doesn't seem to be any pretense that it's like a self-help manual. It's escapism.
No. I mean, his other book was called, Imaginative Sex. It wasn't called This Is How Men and Women Should Relate to Each Other. It was about having sexy fun times, not anything else.
And even in that, I think he pulls away from suggesting, for instance, there should be actual hitting. He suggests, like, instead of whipping your partner, clapping loudly.
Yeah, that's right.
It's very much. Whether that was for the benefit of publication in an earlier time or whatever, but that's very much kind of this is a fantasy rather than this is a compulsory lifestyle choice.
Yeah,
and you're doing something wrong if you're not doing it. What's the reception been? How's this going?
It's been a bit weird. When it was crowdfunded originally, and while I was raising the money for it, I mean, this was back in 2014, we had a lot of delays. There was a lot of fuss and hostility and, horrible threats and trolling and, all the kind of stuff you expect, I guess, really, kind of going on. Which was actually helpful for raising money because it was free publicity. So, some people don't seem to understand the Streisand effect still. But then it got delayed and delayed and delayed. The artist had a lot of personal life problems. I employed Michael Manning, who is a kind of celebrated fetish artist, and did a fantastic job on the book. But he just had so many real life problems that we went well over time. So it took 3 years to come to publication when it should have been a year at the most. So by the time it actually came out, a lot of the fuss seemed to have boiled away, and I think we've had a kind of at least a slight turning point against the kinds of people who were having problems with it and creating all the fuss. I think things have calmed down and turned against them a bit. Which in a way is a shame because I could have done with more publicity again when it came out.
Just as a quick side question, sorry.
But it's done well. When
you talk about there being kind of a fuss about it, is that coming from within the gaming community, or is that coming from outside the RPG gaming community?
A bit of both.
I obviously don't want to go into too much depth on it, but it just is an interesting.
I'm just trying to figure out how to describe it. Okay, you guys are old enough to remember the Satanic Panic around D&D, right?
Yes.
I mean, you said you on the front of the newspaper and everything, and you know how that was, and people said all kinds of horrible things about the games and so on. But this stuff was coming from outside. It was coming from Pat Pulling and Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons, and the Mazes and Monsters film, and priests banging on about it. What's been different about the problems in the tabletop gaming community and more broadly with things like Gamergate is that the attacks on the hobbies have been coming from groups within those hobbies. That's different to these previous moral panics. It's different to what happened with Frederick Wortham. It's different to what happened with the PMRC and the whole music thing. It's different to what happened with D&D. It's fundamentally different to all of that. Even Jack Thompson, when he came after video games, it's come from within the community, and that's what's different. There is this kind of politicized indie scene that's very, very Rick. And then they tend to go after other creators who have a different vision. And that's what's been different. That's what really worries me about it. The fact that it's coming from within now really deeply concerns me.
I think this is interesting, because I wondered if we'd get onto this, because my first thing to say is I don't do video games. I believe they're a passing fad, and we will get past this unnecessary deviation from the right and true path. But my knowledge of my kind of soul knowledge of Gamergate is stuff like the reaction to the all-female Ghostbusters movie, or like the accusations of trolling, and then there's something about it all being about ethics in gaming journalism, which I don't really get.
Spoiler alert, it wasn't largely, but you know.
But it's kind of like, I'm just sat here going like, well, are we all meant to be having fun? So I think you've got a different take on it, and probably more knowledge on it than me. But it's kind of like maybe I'm only seeing people from, if you like, that indie scene, even though I'm not really an indie gamer. But so. Well, this might be going on to your next project, but what's your take on it?
Well, yeah, this next project is a book on Gamergate, and it is, I was involved. I was very much part of it from the start, from before it was Gamergate. I mean, it was always going to be something that got its hooks into me, because even before that, I've been heavily involved in free expression movements, anti-censorship, due to my involvement in kind of protecting role-playing during the Satanic Panic, even though I was very young at the time. I was writing pamphlets, I was writing letters to newspapers, and so on. I've been involved in anti-censorship activism to do with the recent censorship of pornography by our government and so on. I've been targeted by these kinds of people in the past for things I've written, games material I've done. So there was no way I wasn't going to end up involved, and this new project is very much about describing that. I mean, you said it wasn't about ethics in games journalism. It really was for a huge number of people. But there's this, because the people who were caught up in the scandal initially were, what's the phrase? A protected class, women, at least at the start, or supposedly at the start. Doesn't mean they didn't do anything wrong, but there's this handy kind of protective shield you can throw up and say, oh, all these people giving me a hard time are only doing it because they're misogynistic. Ignore all these things I did wrong. Ignore the fact that I was sleeping with all these people that gave me positive coverage or whatever, and that was just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much stuff that came out since then. Ignore all that. Everyone's picking on me, and it's because I'm a woman. That's not to say that there wasn't trolling on both sides. I mean, things got so bad for me during that. I suffer from severe clinical, properly diagnosed depression, and I was in a slump at the height of the initial parts of Gamergate, and I got so disappointed in so many people not bothering to research, not bothering to read up the abuse I was getting from people who were anti-Gamergate, the friendships that were damaged and so on, that it ended up driving me into a suicide attempt. And after that, I was sent razor blades in the post by someone. I don't know who it was. That's a lovely, nice thing for people to do. But you don't hear about that side of it. You don't hear about what happened to me. You don't hear about the other people on my side of the argument who got death threats or lost their jobs or whatever, genuinely just for being anti-censorship and wanting a more ethical games media. I mean, it was nothing new. There was stuff going on for years, like Gerstmann Gate. I mean, you're not familiar with video games, but someone wrote a bad review for a game.
Massive.
The company behind that game was sponsoring the website that he wrote for, and they used pressure to get him fired. So, it's nothing new. This has been going on for ages. It it blew up again. But you only ever hear one side.
I kind of don't want to go down this rabbit hole too much.
Yeah,
I'm conscious that,
I understand.
I'm conscious that we are not going to agree on this.
Yeah.
Okay, let's just say that.
But
I think
civilized disagreement is a good thing.
But
so,
I think for me, irrespective of the individual rights and wrongs of the cases, what I found frustrating was when you're looking at, for example, ethics in video games journalism, the ethical abuses that go on between, say, publishers and major gaming sites, for example, and the YouTube environment, for example, which is astonishingly corrupt in terms of early access for good reviews and all that kind of stuff. That energy isn't expended there. That energy was expended in this fight over, effectively, minorities coming into what's previously been a kind of white male hobby. And that was very much my perception of it. Not that some of these accusations are invalid, and some of them may or may not be, because I didn't, after a certain point I was just like, I can't keep up with this. It makes me sad and angry. But to me, what became quite striking was that, there was an energy expended on targeting previously vulnerable groups, essentially, that are new to the hobby, demographically new to the hobby, in a kind of no girls in this treehouse, or no gays in this treehouse kind of effort. Now, I appreciate that's not everybody's motive, and I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I appreciate there's backlash, but that was my perception of it.
See, I consider that to be the false narrative that was thrown up to protect people against the accusations of corruption and censorship and so on. Whereas to me, what was really going on were some genuine problems. I mean, just the people that I knew within Gamergate were far more diverse and members of minority groups and so on than the people on the opposite side who tended to be white middle class ricks again,
But sure. But I mean, like I said, the observation that I found was not that argument is invalid. That debate isn't necessarily worth having. It might be worth having in a kind of civilized environment. But the fact that when you're looking at, say, corruption in the gaming industry, you don't see a massive campaign against,
It's a complicated issue. I'm trying to go into all of this in the book, but the main thing for me is that only one side of the story is being told and going into records. I mean, the Wikipedia entry is trash. All of the major news stories are absolute rubbish. Much of them are misrepresenting stuff. So my motivation for writing this book is to give a kind of gonzo social history of the other side. So at least the other side of the narrative is out there. People can read both sides and then come to their own conclusions.
Oh, sure. We're totally going to have to agree to differ unless you want to go on for another hour about it. But what I do find fascinating to step back
Switzerland.
No, can I just say, what I do find fascinating to step back a section is that in this and other similar blobs, everybody thinks they're the guy punching up, which I find really interesting.
Yeah.
There's everybody, if we got somebody on from the other side of it, they'd be the guys or women or whoever that were being punched down on and they were trying to punch up. And you're saying the same thing, right?
Well, yeah, I don't want to get too far into
No, neither do I, but I objectively find that really interesting. And that's the tone of debate. Just generally.
Well, that's
across the
debate.
That's the new dynamic, though. Power lies in victimhood and claiming victimhood. That's where the power in a lot of these social dynamics lies these days. If you can set yourself up to be the person on the bottom rung, perversely, that gives you a huge amount of social power.
And I mean, from my position as, shall we say, I don't want to be Switzerland. I'm going to be Sweden. Anyway, my position as Sweden in this particular context. I told you my taste with vanilla. If we got,
is your taste cuckoo cakes and chocolate?
Not Sweden, no.
Oh, Sweden, not Switzerland.
Finland's nice.
I said I'm not Switzerland. I'm not. No, Finland's a bit kind of semi-Eastern Bloc, so it doesn't
describe
work
your
as a
sexuality as a country, I think is what we're saying.
But if Is it a case that basically once they get out into the internet and fueled by this heat that gets generated, basically just become a Wild West brawl, and then for somebody who comes in and is looking from outside, it's impossible to tell sort of the signal from noise.
Yeah, especially for
or the light from the heat.
Especially for what you might call normies, I guess, people who aren't really deep into internet culture. They can't necessarily pick up on the cues to tell who's serious and who's trolling. And any big controversy inevitably attracts trolls, and they just muddy the waters to the point where, unless you're deep into this stuff, you've got no hope of deciphering what's really going on, who's serious, who's being ironic, who's saying stuff just to wind somebody up. Yeah, and plus it serves both sides of these conflicts to take trolls seriously and pretend that what they're saying is someone's genuine point of view. I mean, there's what's it called, Lewis's law, that states that any comments under an article about feminism prove the need for feminism. And that's all obviously tautological. I mean, you could say, any comments under an article about white nationalism prove the need for white nationalism, and that would be absurd. The mere fact that someone objects to what you're saying, whether it's sincerely or not, doesn't prove your point. You've got to stand on your own 2 feet.
And it's not like there's one flavour of feminism, is there?
No.
I mean,
I'm just using that as an example because
but I'm deliberately bringing that out because obviously there is a big issue on the status of transgender women.
Yeah, you got TERFs, don't you? Yeah, and you got sex positive and sex negative and all the rest.
Yeah, and so there's it's not that it's one. Just taking that ideology as a case in point, it's not an ideology. So the fact that comments prove the case about feminism, well, which feminism? Yeah. Pick your feminism.
Well, it's the same thing with Gamergate. I mean, I don't think anyone would deny that there were bad actors. I mean, I've run afoul of some of them myself. I mean, in raising the money for this book, I had a bunch of Gamergate extremists called Gamergate Revolt come after me, telling me I was scamming people out of money and using all kinds of slurs and horribleness. There's horrible people out there on all sides. I don't think there's any denying that.
I think there's a certain truth that the internet does mean you don't need to invent straw men. You can just go and find one.
Yeah.
If you want a view to prove your point about the bad intentions of the other side, you can pretty much find it.
Yeah.
So
anyway, do we want to pop back to Gore just to wrap up?
Let's pop back to Gore to wrap up. But let's say, well, what's next for Gore? What's next for? Well, actually, we haven't spoken about the system. I think we should speak about that briefly. Yeah. Because you're using D6, which, like I said, I think at the start, me and Matt, I'm running and Matt's playing in a D6 game. It's a nice, flexible little system. It works well for pulp because it has quite a few systems have kind of points you can spend to get a bonus on rolls or to get a better roll, but this actually has 2 different types of points. So if it's like a slightly important roll, you can boost it. If it's a critically important roll, you can double it. And I find it works really well. Do you think they find that, Matt, on Wednesdays?
Yeah, I like it. I think it's quick, it's intuitive. That's the main thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's not one of these ones where, write 5 names and then sort of every time you sit down to play, you have to do some shadow puppetry to try and work out what your actual attributes are.
Hey, I like those systems.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, I mean, I chose it for a bunch of reasons, and you've brought some of those up there. I mean, it fits pulp. Part of the reason I chose it was because it was the system that drove the original West End Games Star Wars system, which was an introductory RPG to a lot of people. And I was aware that there's this huge group of people that have already been role-playing Gore, but in a free-form fashion without rules. So I wanted something that had an established track record as an introductory system for new people to pick up, but which also had enough depth for more experienced role players. I felt that D6 fit that very well. Plus, it's open and free to use now, which is always a nice thing. And the other thing is, Gore's society, at least in civilized Gore, is very much based on a caste system. So you've got your warrior caste, your initiates, which are like priests. You've got your assassins caste, you've got your peasants caste, or whatever. And the original Star Wars used archetypes. So you would have like farm boy or whatever, and then you would customize it. So that was a very quick and easy way of picking up and playing within, 5-10 minutes. Just say, oh, I'm going to play former stormtrooper, and I'll customize my stats like that, and I'm good to go. So with Gore, you can just come to the table and say, okay, I'm going to play a warrior. Okay, I can take that archetype, I can customize it. Okay, I'm good to play. Yeah, so it fit the world. It was easy pick up and play, good starting system. Yeah, all of those factors came into play, and I think D6 just fit that to a T.
Yeah, it's also oddly, I think it works well for online and Skype as well. And if you've got a kind of online community that aren't necessarily going to be physically present, that's quite handy.
6-sided dice are easily available.
Exactly,
if you've got a dice roller built into a program, it's usually going to be 6-sided for the basic thing. So that was another factor. Plus, there's something visceral about picking up a handful of 6-sided dice and rolling them. You get a physical sense for how good your character is at something. I felt that was important.
Yeah, and it's also the way the wild die work as well. So the impending sense of doom as you see that odd-coloured die roll a 1, or that sense of triumph when it rolls a 6, which results in a re-roll, which is even negative if you rolled a 1 or gets added on if you've got a 6, is kind of a nice touch. It kind of the hero, I've definitely called hero points, but like the character points and hero points or whatever give you kind of a little bit of a safety valve, but then that wild die gives it a little bit of a opportunity for random chance to give those flourishes and disasters.
Yeah, and I gave characters in Gore an honor system, which is another big thing in Gore. So you have honor points, and so long as you act according to the codes and rules of your caste or your position in society, you get honor points, which you can then spend to give you that double dice roll you were mentioning earlier. So that's a mechanical way of encouraging people to buy into the game world.
Yeah, which works well. I mean, I'm a big fan of, or I was, I don't think I've got the patience or the brain now, but of the FGU game. So things like Bushido, where the mechanics kind of geared you to playing in medieval Japan. And also Pendragon has also got, with the traits, it's got very much hardwired into it. If you're going to be a Christian knight, say, the way the traits and stuff work steers you in a certain direction. So that makes a good intuitive sense for any system where there's a game world where people are very invested in.
Yeah.
So that's good on the system. So what's the plans next? You mentioned something about an adventure chain?
Yeah, so we're publishing adventures that roughly follow, at least geographically, where the books went. So in roughly the same order, we'll be traveling our adventures from city to city. And there's a vague overarching plot in the background of each adventure. There's similar themes and things that come up. So we're planning... hopefully, if sales continue to keep up and we can afford to renew the license, we're hoping to have that kind of initial chain of 30-odd adventures. They're about 6,000 words each, so slightly longer than a convention scenario, I guess, depending how you wanted to play it. But the perennial problem for any publisher is that adventures don't sell well. What I've tried to do is to increase the longevity and usefulness of the adventures by including new rules and so on. So there'll be added value to the adventures.
I mean, I certainly as a teenager and a student and as a Dolite and then an underemployed person, I didn't tend to buy adventures. And even now, as a father and a professional person, I find that it's for me, it's all like I got the Dracula dossier, and it's beautiful, it's an amazing piece of work. But I can't do enough homework to ever use that effectively, I don't think. whereas let's say I play Hero Kids with my kids. A Hero Kids adventure, I'll pay a couple of dollars because it's kind of like a White Dwarf scenario length, and that's something I can kind of pick up and play. Yeah. But with the bigger stuff, it's better to just do my own stuff because that fits my work-life balance. I know other people who now they're like sort of grown-ups love to buy published scenarios because it just takes that legwork out of them and that works for them. But yeah, I don't have the attention span, I don't think.
I actually tend to find them more work because players tend to stray, and there's no way a published adventure can account for all the different ways in which players can go off the rails. You know, there's value in buying a couple of adventures when you've bought a new system to try and kind of see how the designers intend for the game to be played. Yeah, there's some value in that, and kind of seeing it in practice in a way. You know, you can see that in the early adventures. But yeah, it's a perennial problem as a designer. You know, finding a way to make adventures appealing and get people to buy them. So for me, that's by trying to give them more longevity and usefulness, and including optional rules and stuff, so people have more than one reason to buy them.
So it's not just a scenario; it's a supplement as well.
Yeah. So like one of the ones I've done recently, you've got your adventure, which is about 2/3 of the book, and then at the back there's some rules on. Sort of mechanical rules for enslaving people, given that it's gore, and for handling torture and those kinds of unsavory things, but giving you a system to handle it when it comes to NPCs, so that you can fade to black and just roll dice instead of having to play it out. You know.
Well, that's what I was going to say. For somebody, depending on what level people want to play things, then that gives them the excuse to say, well, there's a system for that, and off you go. It's like if somebody playing Pendragon don't want to get involved in courtship, there's a courtly love subsystem, and there's roll on the table to see if your wife gets pregnant every winter phase.
Yeah.
Other more role players will want to play more elements of that, which is fine if that's what people around the table want to do. All right, so that's cool. Matt, have you got any further comments?
No, I think we're covered actually.
Well, I
don't know much about gore. It's been really interesting.
Yeah, it has a bad reputation, far in excess of what it actually is. I think.
Yes, I think that seems like a fair assessment.
I think when you're talking about straw men, I think because of its size and longevity, let's put it this way: I'm sure if more people knew about, say, I don't know, Notes from a Darkening Island, which has racial themes in it, they'd be up in arms about that. But that was like one novel from the 1970s, because gore takes up a shelf in the science fiction library at your university club.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's gonna get more flack, whatever the content, whatever the potential offensiveness of the relative offensiveness of the content might be, because it's up there to be hit. So thank you very much for your time. Where would people, if people want to dig a bit deeper into gore role playing, where would they find your products?
I've got links to pretty much everything of mine from my main blog, which is postmortemstudios.wordpress.com. Or you can find me on Twitter and bug me at
link in the show notes, as I say.
Yeah. And we'll put it in the show notes. So thank you very much for your time, James. That was fun.
You're welcome.
That was good. All right for you.
Yeah. Good night, everyone.
Thank you very much. Okay. Take care. So this is Dissecting World signing off. What's our next episode? Our next episode is martial arts. It's another sideways step, and we will have a historical European martial artist on to talk about that. So thank you very much for your time, folks, and good night.
Good night.
Say good night, James.
Good night, James.
We value feedback, corrections and your opinions. Either email us at dissectingworlds@yahoo.co.uk or follow us on Twitter. Details are on the show notes.